there was a genocide of Jews in the heart of a continent that had been Christian for centuries. Cardinal Cushing from Boston gave a very impassioned address in, I think, September the 29th of 1964 in Latin. Most people couldn't understand what he was saying because of his thick Boston accent, but when they reread his text later, they discovered that he had said, if too many people were silent in recent history, we must not be silent any longer. And this was a very potent argument, as you can well imagine. All right, to jump over then a very interesting history of all the tugging back and forth that went on, part of which resulted in Nostra Aetate addressing all the world's religions and not only Jews and Judaism. Let me highlight several points of it, and then I'm just going to jump to the present. Jump over 5 decades is better than 20 centuries. So the document begins in a very uncharacteristically Catholic way. It begins by asking universal questions that all human beings tend to ask themselves. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? What is the purpose of life? And it then goes on to say religious traditions have grown up in the world that try and answer these questions. So what's a departure from the Catholic norm here is that typically documents of the church, particularly before this time period, would begin by saying something like, to us has been given the fullness of the truth. We have the deposit of the faith, and we are now going to sort of dole that out to the rest of the benighted world. So by beginning with this more of a solidarity with the human condition, the posture was quite different and invited dialogue, which is in fact what the document would go on to do. Secondly, it went on to say in chapter 2, after discussing Buddhism and Hinduism and in general terms the religions of the Far East, that the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is holy in these other religious traditions. Now, this may seem sort of trite or rather basic today, but to acknowledge holiness in another religious tradition was something you would have searched in vain to find people saying before. So this is a radical departure. And notice that they are also described as reflecting a ray of truth that enlightens all people. So again, the very posture has changed in a very fundamental sort of a way. Chapter 3 addresses Islam in very positive terms, again, unprecedented in the history of Catholic documents. Others may talk about that more here. I want to focus on chapter 4, as I said, the heart of the document, really, because that was its origination, and the longest section of the document, although it's only 18 sentences in Latin. Here, just to abstract from those sentences, here are the most influential points that it made. It repudiated the notion of Jews being under a curse because of the crucifixion of Jesus. It stressed that there is an intimate spiritual connection between Jews and Christians. Without articulating it exactly, although this would happen later, the reason for that is we share, as scriptural texts, many of the same biblical books from ancient Israel. They're ordered in a different sequence and whatnot, but nonetheless, no two other religious communities share a scriptural canon like that. Thirdly, it strongly implied, and this was later made quite explicit by John Paul II, that Jews and God are abiding in an eternal covenant that has never been revoked. This is huge. This is gigantic. But I won't say any more. 4, it deplored anti-Semitism and hatred against Jews at any time and by anyone. That's pretty strong. Now, at the time it was criticized, and with some degree of fairness or legitimacy, because the way it spoke about anti-Semitism, it was as if people from the planet Jupiter were the anti-Semites, and it didn't turn a self-critical gaze upon the church's own history. That happened later. This was opening the doorway to that, I would say. Fifthly, it stressed that there was a need for accurate biblical interpretation and for religious education about the accurate interpretation of the Bible, at least as Catholics understand it. I can go into that more if you'd like. It called for dialogue. And again, today this says, well, big deal, called for dialogue. When I was a boy at the time of the council, I wasn't following it assiduously. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. But had my parents wanted to go to the wedding of friends who were in the Lutheran church, we would have had to have gotten dispensation from our pastor to do so, all right? Dialogue was not the watchword of the 1960s, but it became that. And every Catholic document since, and by the way, other similar things happen in Protestant traditions too. I don't mean to make this exclusivist in any way. But every document since Nostra Aetate calls for dialogue, and we'll see where that has led. And finally, and not insignificantly, quite intentionally, Nostra Aetate did not even hint at a desire for Jews to convert. And as one of the sessions in the council that debated Nostra Aetate, one of the bishops speaking then said, if we even hint in this direction, dialogue becomes impossible. And that is something that had to be learned and relearned and relearned in the 5 decades since Nostra Aetate. Some of the debates on this score I was involved in the last 15 years or so. But that's off the table today. So that's Nostra Aetate. Where are we today? Funny you should ask. So today, of course, as we all know, Pope Francis is the Pope, in case you hadn't heard. And I want to say a few things about him because in a way he embodies the changes that Nostra Aetate wrought. He's born in Argentina, as you know, the son of Italian immigrants. Jorge Mario Bergoglio's formation as a priest and a bishop, his education, his spirituality, are post-conciliar. And that's really significant. He's the first pope formed, developed spiritually after the Second Vatican Council. As Archbishop of Buenos Aires, as you know, he enjoyed close relations with other Christian communities, with Jews and with Muslims. And one of the close relationships he had, as you probably or has, is with Rabbi Abraham Skorka, the rector of the Latin American Seminary, the Rabbinical Seminary in Buenos Aires. Together they wrote a book of their dialogues over the span of like 16 months. There's the cover of it. It became a bestseller as soon as he was elected Pope. No surprise there. And here's the point I want to stress. He is the first pope in history, as I have here, to have engaged in theological conversation as an adult with close Jewish friends. The first pope in history. Now, I want to stress the word adult here because John Paul II, as you know, had Jewish friends. Grew up in Wadowice in Poland. He was on the Jewish soccer team in the town, but all his friends died in the Shoah, with one exception. And he never talked religion with them particularly, and he was a teenager or younger at the time. Francis is different because they've engaged in profound conversation. And that sets the pattern for what's to come. Notice the things he says. So he issued what's called an apostolic exhortation in January of 2014 called The Joy of the Gospel, Evangelii Gaudium. Look what he says. Dialogue and friendship with the children of Israel, Jewish people, are part of the life of Jesus' disciples. The friendship which has grown between us makes us bitterly and sincerely regret the terrible persecutions they have endured and continue to endure, especially those that have involved Christians. Okay, that's what's notable there is the stress on friendship, and I think that reflects the Latin American culture in which both he and Rabbi Skorka grew up. But notice the theological significance of the next paragraph. God continues to work among the people of the Old Covenant and to bring forth treasures of wisdom which flow from their encounter with his word. In other words, in Catholic theological jargon, not specifically Catholic, but in Christian theological jargon, the Logos, the Word of God, is alive and well in the Jewish community, not just in biblical Israel, but today. That's hugely significant. In another passage, he talks about the Holy Spirit being operative in the Jewish community today. So for this reason, he goes on, the church also is enriched when she receives the values of Judaism. So far from urging Catholics not to get contaminated by Jewish ideas, which a draft of a papal encyclical in 1938 had said, there's been a total reversal. We need to learn from Jews. And in fact, we need to learn from each other, will be said. So here's my take on where Catholic-Jewish relations are today. I'm going to focus on one aspect. There's other things that could be said, but my time is running out, so I'm going to zero in on a few highlights as I see them. In certain parts of the world, and particularly here in the United States, Catholics and Jews and again, I don't mean Catholic in a purely exclusivist way, but certainly among Catholics and Jews, I think we've reached a mature level in our dialogue that we can begin to chart what I'm calling the unexplored paths of mutuality. Part of the reason for that in the United States is because Catholics and Jews live together side by side in large numbers as immigrants to large American cities, beginning 19th century, but really accelerating in the 20th century, working together for labor rights, for child labor law controls, for the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and so on. This is significant. Here's what I mean by mutuality in this context. It's a deepening love for the distinct way of walking with God in the Jewish or Christian other. And that Jewish or Christian other is no longer an outsider or an alien or a stranger, but has become a friend. And therefore you value the holiness that you encounter in their difference from you. We've learned that in 50 years. And by the way, we never had this environment in 2,000 years. So we are literally, I know this sounds grandiose, but we are literally living in unprecedented times. It's now possible, therefore, to share theological conversations, as I just said, that couldn't have been had before because the trust didn't exist, the threat of conversion has been removed, and all of, et cetera. Here's some topics. So this is probably the most important slide in what I'm giving you, but it's also the one I'm going to speak about the least. But just to sort of whet your appetite for the kinds of things that are now being able to be spoken about, is it possible that we can affirm revelations of God in the other community in which we don't share? So for Jews looking on Christians, is it possible to say, God is at work in that community because I see in Christianity at its best the traces of the Holy One present there. And even though I don't share as a Jew in the revelation that gives rise to that behavior, it resonates with my own experience of God and how God works in covenant with us. For Christians, for example, just to flesh this out, I don't know what it means to live in covenant according to Torah. To understand that I, as a Jew, am commanded to do certain things. Again, there's varying traditions of Jewish interpretation as to what that means in actuality, but from a Christian point of view, it's simply, I don't know what that means. I've not had that experience. But when I see a Jewish friend putting on phylacteries to pray at synagogue, and I sense holiness present, I know that this is a religious tradition with which I am affiliated or akin, or we have a relationship. That's what I mean by recognizing revelation in the other community. Again, I doubt this has happened very much in the past. Both of our traditions have this paradoxical belief that God is both transcendent and immanent. We believe that God is beyond the created order of things, but we also believe that God is involved in our histories. We both say God intervened at certain moments in history. For Jews, the Exodus and the gift of Torah. For Christians, the resurrection of the crucified one. So if God is both involved in history and yet also transcendent, how do we put that together? Christians developed Trinitarian ideas. Some branches of Jewish mysticism devised other ideas of God's emanations that work in the world. Can we learn from one another's efforts to grapple with this paradoxical belief that is integral to our respective identities? Thirdly, is it possible to discern God in contemporary events? You know, some members of both the Jewish and Christian communities see God's hand at work in everything. Hurricane hitting Miami is because of homosexuality run amok in the United States, somebody said 3 years ago. Okay. I'm not comfortable with that interpretation of human history at this point. Others in both of our communities say God isn't involved in human history at all, which I think is kind of a challenge to fundamental understandings of Jews and Christians of themselves. So where's the happy medium? How do you discern these things? I could say a lot about this, but you get the idea. Can we talk to one another about these things? Lastly, next to lastly, the centrality of the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, for Jews, as part of their covenantal relationship with God, is something that Christians have no cognate of, or for, whatever the correct preposition is. In fact, we have a counter-tradition over history of denying that Jews have any ongoing covenant at all, whether it involves land or whatever. How do we understand that? What do we do with it? Let alone in the unprecedented and astonishing historical context of the existence of a modern nation state called Israel. Jews haven't figured that out yet. Christians haven't figured that out yet. Maybe we can help each other make sense of these things. And lastly, and most mysteriously, what I'm going to say, a growing topic is focusing on our relationship itself. Is it one of simple reciprocity, where, okay, you say nice things about me, and we'll say nice things about you, something that, by the way, a famous Orthodox rabbi in the 1960s was concerned about, Rav Joseph Soloveitchik, warned against an exchange of theological favors that would lead to a sort of loss of identity and distinctiveness. Maybe we're moving to something that's more akin to complementarity, by which I mean we can detect resonances of our own experience of God and the other tradition and mutually enrich one another by it without loss of distinction. Although we're going to understand the borders between us differently. We're not going to look on each other the same as we did when we were hostile. So this is what I mean, just to give you a little appetite whetter of the kinds of questions we now can discuss. Let me go back to synagogue and ecclesia.